Hi, everybody, and good evening. Thanks to all of our viewers for joining us tonight for Escape Velocity Extra, produced by the Museum of Science Fiction in Washington, D.C. Escape Velocity Extra is an ongoing web-based series of programs that brings real-world scientists, engineers, astronauts, authors, and other luminaries of science and technology together with actors from the various movies and TV shows that bring science fiction to life. While science fiction in many ways explores the art of what the future holds, it also allows us to provide a unique form of commentary on the world today. After all, some of the greatest works of science fiction, literature, film, and television are truly just metaphors for the issues and concerns that we face right now. In that vein, this session is especially topical as it addresses the alarming trend of police brutality against Black and brown bodies that has been illuminated by George Floyd's murder. So in the fallout of his untimely death, we've seen a corporate revolution of sorts, aimed at in many ways at addressing the offensive symbols and icons that still permeate our society that are associated with slavery and its aftermath. But while all attempts at greater diversity and understanding are appreciated, some measures aimed at addressing racism oftentimes fail to address its systemic roots. So we at the Museum of Science Fiction want to frame that critical conversation in light of speculative fiction, which is both a mirror into society and a portal into our future. So during our first session, a conversation between four experts in the field of SF will explore the representation of policing in all of its forms throughout science and speculative fiction, taking a look at moments and narratives of incarceration, the drive towards resistance, and the complexities of respectability politics. I see some of you coming in. There was a little technical difficulty, so this specific link that some of you are in is for panelists only. So if you're having trouble, please just go check your email and you'll be redirected to the appropriate link. So continuing on in the second section of our program, which will begin in about 75 minutes from now, we'll hear from three actors from two legendary science fiction shows, Star Trek Voyager, which enjoyed a 7-year run from 1995 to 2001, and The Orville, which is still in the air and having run for its first 2 seasons on Fox, will also be debuting its 3rd season on Hulu. So those actors are Tim Russ, who played Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, but who's also appeared on several other episodes in the Star Trek universe and even one episode of The Orville. Garrett Wang, who is Ensign Harry Kim on the Voyager, as well as Peter Macon, who portrays the Moclan, Bortus, on Orville. So while we will talk about their respective shows, the actors' backgrounds, and the roles that they portray, tonight's program will also take a far deeper dive into race and resistance in science and speculative fiction. To join and participate in this discussion, please be sure to register at the show's website, which is escapevelocity.extra/EVX. The cost is $5, which will be a tax-deductible contribution to the Museum of Science Fiction, shown at the bottom of your screen right now. But first, we are thrilled to present our conversation with 4 individuals who regularly teach, discuss, publish in the fields of science and speculative fiction, particularly in reference to race. And I would like to introduce you to those special guests. So first, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Aisha Matthews, and among other things, I am the Director of Literary Programming for the Museum of Science Fiction's annual Escape Velocity Conference, which usually takes place in DC once a year. Given the situation of COVID, we're trying out something new, so that is where EVX comes in. I'm also the managing editor of the museum's Journal of Science Fiction, and my personal research interests include Afrofuturism, Black speculative literature, and postmodern feminist theory, among other things. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. André Carrington, an associate professor of English at the University of California-Riverside. His book, Speculative Blackness, The Future of Race in Science Fiction, takes an in-depth look at representations of race in speculative literature, comics, and fan fiction. And his most recent project, Audiofuturism, the transatlantic circuit of science fiction radio drama, explores race in science fiction radio broadcasts throughout the ages. He's also a veteran of Escape Velocity, having joined us for discussions of race and Afrofuturism in 2017 and 2019. So thank you, André, and welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Derrick Kilgore, an associate professor of English at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is the author of Afrofuturism, Science, Race, and Visions of Utopia in Space, which takes a critical and historical look at the evolution of race in American science fiction and the tradition of technological utopianism. He's also the author of This Time for Africa, Afrofuturism as Alternate American History, an essay that'll be included in the anthology Afrofuturism in Time and Space, which is edited by our fellow panelists that I'll be introducing you to next. DeWitt is similarly a veteran of Escape Velocity, having participated in discussions of race, alien encounters, and Afrofuturism in 2017 and 2018. So welcome, DeWitt. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, hello.
Okay, next up, we have Isiah Lavender III. He is a first-time speaker at Escape Velocity, but is pretty well known throughout the field of science fiction studies. Isiah is a professor of English at the University of Georgia and is the author of both Race in American Science Fiction, a study of systemic racism and the visibility of race in science fiction, as well as Afrofuturism Rising, the literary Prehistory of a movement, which charts the formal and informal history of Afrofuturist writing. So welcome, Isiah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And last but not least, we have Dr. Yazak, another first-time speaker at Escape Velocity and the Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech. Along with Isiah Lavender, Lisa is the editor of Literary Afrofuturism in the 21st Century. And that collection of essays examines the aesthetic evolution of Afrofuturism in our contemporary moment. I hope that's right. I kind of winged it. She's also the author of Sisters of Tomorrow, the First Women of Science Fiction, which highlights the monumental contributions that women have made to an often predominantly male genre of science fiction. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks so much for having me here.
So everybody, just to kind of get us started and kick us off, I wanted to start by asking kind of an introductory question to each of you to orient us to the discussion, kind of orient your views to the subjects at hand. So I'll start with you, André. I know that your work is often very interdisciplinary, particularly across mediums as well as subgenres. And so I wondered, for those watching at home, if you can tell us what you feel science and speculative fictions can teach us about how to look at and live through our current sociopolitical moment.
Thanks. I really think speculative fiction and visions of utopia, defined really broadly, can help us understand how people who have come before us have made it through difficult times and how we have gotten to the times that we live in now, which seemed impossible from where, our forebears were when they struggled with similar challenges. In particular, I really think that when we hear statements like abolish the police, or we hear statements like everyone deserves health care, or we hear statements like, every child deserves to live up to, their dreams and to grow up in a world where they might do better than their parents' generation. Those statements that are so hard to believe right now are exactly the sorts of inspiration that people bring to imagining utopia and dreaming of things that seem impossible. So we really need that kind of thought right now. And if it's clearer to us right now that that thought is fiction than fact, then we should use all of our skills to treat it that way and aspire to make it reality.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you, André. So next I'll move to DeWitt. So your forthcoming project, particularly your essay, to my understanding, talks about Afrofuturism as alternate American history. So I kind of pose a similar question to you of how speculative narratives are useful for maybe conceptualizing current and alternative arrangements of policing and resistance.
Thank you. Well, science fiction has often been thought of as a genre that hosts thought experiments, particularly in terms of social futures. And so that's been part of the genre ever since H.G. Wells' Time Machine, particularly when you start thinking about how it has us thinking about history. And what makes science fiction possible, of course, is the idea that things could change. They could change for the better, they could change for the worse. So the genre contains both those ideas, the idea that the future could be worse than our present, but also that the future could be much better than ours. And so then you have to start asking questions about, well, what tools do we have? What values or virtues do we have that would make for better futures? In Afrofuturism, the dominant way of thinking through these this notion is to imagine what kinds of history we would have, and what kind of future that we might have if the world system was Afrocentric rather than Eurocentric, right? If the world system had a history that rested on the values of the cultures, religions, languages, ways and practices, philosophies that grew up on the continent of Africa rather than in Europe. And that's a good way of perhaps breaking out of some of our unthought biases about what is good, what is true, how history proceeds or doesn't proceed, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
So then I have one for you, Isiah, as well. So kind of your works look at, among other things, the history of Afrofuturism and speculative literature. So kind of what would you say speculative fiction offers in discussions of policing that other genres either don't or can't?
Well, in thinking about this is really where my next book is going, in critical race theory and science fiction, where I'm looking at different subgenres of science fiction, like cyberpunk and Generation Starships, zombie narratives, and things like that. But something that really strikes home for me right now is Tachi Onyebuchi's Riot Baby, and how that story follows two superpowered siblings, Ella and Kev, and how Kev slowly develops into a superpowered being, whereas his sister is struggling with that from his beginning when he's born during the LA riots in 1992, and the way Onyebuchi works history into it of police brutality against Black people, which I find very compelling and well done, to the point where Kev is arrested, stays at Rikers Island in New York for almost 7-8 years and doesn't even know time is passing, and his sister drops in on him in fascinating ways, right? In terms of astral projection and keeping him sane as he's going through the system. And I think he's ready to burn it all down at the end of the novel. He and his sister look into the future, and that's what they do, and they start over, and you can see that right now. I don't know if I'm going to say Kenosha properly, but this suburb of Wisconsin, where we have this violence going on right now. And so it's I think science fiction can provide answers, some good, some bad. And so in terms of the critical race theory, we are seeing Black science fiction writers create counter narratives, to use the CRT term, right now, in terms of how we should approach police, and looking at this panopticon that exists, at least in Riot Baby, where you have these little metal spheres, kind of like the film Phantasm, except they follow you and observe you, and so we're always under surveillance. And so it's interesting and to think about how interest convergence also works into this idea, where the idea that if white people think it's good for them and it's good for Black people at the same time, then they'll go ahead and do it because it's benefiting white people most, right? And so you get that idea popping up in Riot Baby and some other works that we can get into later. But it's all about removing color blindness and helping people become color conscious. And I think I'll cut myself off there for now.
Absolutely. I think the discussion of unseating the notion of color blindness is definitely something to return to in this discussion of policing in particular. So last but not least again, for Lisa. So I know you teach a lot of courses in science fiction. And I wondered how you believe students and kind of fans in general can use Black speculative fiction and speculative fiction more broadly to navigate discussions of and ideas about the state of policing in America.
Yeah, well, I think that it's one of the best ways we can bring students or people who are not already thinking about race relations into these conversations. And this is often true for any kind of progressive or radical politics. Like, you can lecture at people all you want, but you're much more likely to get them interested in learning more if you've got a really killer story with it, right? To tell them and to draw them in. And I find that that's one of the things that works really well with students, is that process of cognition and estrangement that we go through when we read science fiction, that we jump into a story and we say, how could the world possibly be like this? And we assume that at some point in the story, someone's going to explain it in some way that feels plausible to us and that links to our own world. And that's like a perfect way to bring students into these conversations about race that they may not have been thinking about otherwise, or that they may have certain set ideas about that they have a hard time getting around. If you drop students into a story and they say, my goodness, how did the world get this way? How did we end up with a space program dependent on plantation slavery all over again, for instance, as in unkindness of ghosts? And then they sort of follow it through, and it begins to open up ideas. Yes, exactly, right. They begin to connect it with things in their own world. And I think that that's really wonderful. Another great thing, really quickly, I'd say that I'm finding with science fiction this semester in particular is history. Historic science fiction text can be an amazing way to teach, to approach the present, especially when it's a topic that can feel dangerous, especially to younger students of any race, really. I find that all students get very uncomfortable talking about race at first. But if we go back and look at this week, we read H.G. Wells's The Star, and we watched George Méliès' A Trip to the Moon. And students we're so conditioned right now. They were already thinking about race before the class even began. And they were just like, my goodness, these are horrible depictions of the racial other. And this got us into an amazing conversation about colonization and how much science fiction draws on narratives of colonization, especially in its earliest iterations, and how much eventually authors would push back. And I feel like it's already opened up conversations that would be very difficult to have otherwise.
Absolutely. As I think, especially with the media rhetorics oftentimes being a little inflammatory,
Right.
No matter which side of the aisle you're on,
Right.
Definitely useful there. So before we move forward, just another quick announcement for people joining. I know some people are still trying to get in with the panelist link. There was a little tech issue there. So if you're having trouble getting in, please just go to your email. And if you've registered already, you should have the link. Okay. So kind of getting into the thick of our questions. So, a lot of what sparked this discussion is, the rising unrest across the country, particularly in reference to police brutality and questions of how often and how severely racism is driving these encounters often to lethal effect. And so when we think of science fiction, particularly Afrofuturism, thinking of representations of police in these works, kind of, I wonder if there is such a thing as benign policing, right? Because we kind of portray policing in almost every genre as unilaterally problematic, and in many ways it probably is. But I wonder if we can think of any works possibly that have benign policing, and kind of what would that look like in reality?
Well, maybe I'm obsessed, But I think that looking at least parts of Will Smith's career as a science fiction action hero gets us some way towards that. He plays Del Spooner in iRobot. I think it was 2004, 2005, sometime around then. And in that near future Chicago, he, of course, is the center of the narrative. And as a cop, he is the one who gets to decide what's cool, what's not, what's human and what's not, right? He's the one with the gun. And even though sometimes he's embarrassed by having that gun or misrepresenting who's the bad guy, he is the one that we sympathize with. So there's an example of if policing is benign, Will Smith, he represents that, at least in that film. I haven't seen. He did another one for the small screen. What was it? HBO and Netflix called Bright.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
Everybody's seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, that to my recollection, that's similarly. He's kind of positioned in the same way, but because his partner is an alien, you have race and then you have race. So right. he is definitely a good example of someone who kind of goes along those lines quite frequently. Did anyone else have thoughts they wanted to add on that, on what it could even look like for policing to be benign?
I'm thinking of prisoners and thinking of the short story or interconnected story in Walter Mosley's Futureland called Angel's Island, where this chemical company creates these snake packs with chemicals in them that administer doses to keep prisoners docile and doing the work that they need. And then they're also being experimented on, not only the prisoners, but also the guards with all kinds of treatments, inflicting cancer on them, seeing if they can cure it, and then having a lethal dose pack if a prisoner gets 3 strikes, right? And so they can, whenever they're there for over a year, they can not escape, but they can be released, but they're always getting strikes and demerits for wandering across a line that they shouldn't be. And so I'm thinking of a system of control that seems to go hand in hand with stories of that nature. And so I really don't think I've come across stories without violent prison guards, and not to say that they don't exist. I just haven't seen it, or that's not part of the reading that I've done. So I guess they must exist, but I haven't seen it.
Well, no, I think that's fair. I think also there are often times where, we're trying to avoid the simplistic representation of the police as the good guys. And so we're in the era where, I think of Law and Order SVU and the Elliot Stabler, who has, this anger and this rage, but he's the good guy and you identify with him. So maybe that's why we're having some trouble, because it's hard to represent policing as benign without kind of seeming to overlook the reality to some extent.
Yep.
Well, we also, we work in a popular culture environment in which, at least until very recently, well, not until very recently, but for at least 2 decades, police shows have been a regular part of our television diet, right? And you mentioned some of the shows, but it goes back quite a while. And post Starsky and Hutch, which even as a kid, I kind of thought, well, gee, when he was beaten on Huggy Bear, wasn't he violating that man's civil rights? What's going on with all that? There's a sense in which, yes, police are benign. They always catch the bad guy. They are concerned with truth, right? The truth of the matter that's in front of them. I find it very interesting that Ice-T has been on Law and Order for a good portion of his career, when he wrote a famous song against the police, right? And so you kind of wonder, well, you just wonder what that's all about, but it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lisa, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was going to talk about a series of books that I think has a great complicated depiction of the police and race, and that's, I never know, is it Tade Thompson or Toddy Thompson? But he's a Nigerian British writer. So we're going to go with Tade Thompson, so unless anyone's going to correct me here. And it's the Rosewater trilogy, and it's a marvelous set of books if no one's read them before. But aliens have screwed up their own planet, so they've got a plan for a long-term invasion of Earth that involves taking us over cell by cell and then downloading their minds into us. And it turns out the center of the invasion is in Nigeria. And a group of police officers, some of whom are regular police, some of whom are special police, some of whom work for the Secret Service, have to deal with this. And they become sort of the the mediators between the aliens and Earth. And they broker some deals in an attempt to save Earth that are also really interesting and kind of repeat some of the more dangerous aspects of colonialism and certainly of slavery as well. But they do everything with the best of intentions. And that's what's so interesting about this particular story, is that it explores how you can be in these positions of power and yet still sort of be both the police and the criminal all at once. And I think that that's really insightful, right? Especially because, and this is something that both life and literature teaches us, the line between the cop and the criminal is a fine line at best, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that actually takes us kind of towards our next topic, which is really the kind of historical and literary connections between policing, slavery, and the system of Jim Crow. So, most people who are well versed in the field have at least heard of Michelle Alexander's Mass Incarceration and the New Jim Crow, which has emerged as kind of, to my understanding, the premier book on the topic at this moment. But in general, I've also encountered a lot of people who, whether it's gaps in the education people received or just the way the master narrative goes, do not see those connections, kind of feel oftentimes that policing is unrelated, perhaps not knowing, for instance, the history of how the Klan was involved in the police in the early days and those kind of things. So I wonder to what extent we've experienced these interconnections actually being represented and highlighting in science fiction media. If there's any works we can think of that kind of really underscore the extent to which slavery and Jim Crow are related to, or at least have roots in the policing that we do now.
Well, I will jump in here and just bring up the late great Octavia Butler and Kindred, and the first time or third time Dana is back and she runs into her blood relatives that look just like her. I don't know why I'm blanking on names, but anyway, she is attacked by a night patroller, which is an early version of the police in this day and age, and she knows that she has to fight for her life, right? So she knocks him out and somehow gets sent back into the present, right? Because of that fight or flight, or I'm going to die mechanism that sends her back, since it's left unexplained in the novel. And so that's just a very early rendition of what we experience now in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that when we read stories that depict a time traveler, a person who is, out of time, in the wrong time and place where the rules they are used to don't apply to them, or when we read stories that use, figures for different versions of, sentient life or intelligent life, different counterparts for ourselves, like artificial life forms and space aliens and magical beings. Whenever we see images of how those people experience treatment at the hands of, ordinary persons like ourselves in the real world, or treatment that's specific to them, one of the things we're seeing is our mobilization as readers and writers of our knowledge of how some of us are put at the periphery of the human. Some of us are at different times and places, under different conditions, with different pretexts, put in positions to be deprived of our life and liberty in order to kind of hold the norm in place. So when we see images of a person who is an artificial life form, right? Is a replicant, like in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Things can be done to them that can't be done to organic people. And they are, for all intents and purposes, identical. But telling the difference becomes a matter of determining how can they be undone as a person. Is it or is it not legitimate to treat them as if they were not human, even if there's no other basis on which to make that determination about someone with basically the same features. We see the same in stories about aliens living alongside humans, or humans who are suddenly put into situations in contact with beings that have different social rules, that have a different understanding of justice, that humans can suddenly be on the receiving end of treatment that any human isn't supposed to expect, that only Black humans or only humans who are colonial subjects or only humans with disabilities are supposed to expect according to mundane rules. I think that when we see science fiction and fantasy stories in those circumstances, we're working through our real knowledge of what it is like to be policed and to fundamentally confront how being the kind of person who is policed is a matter of being the kind of person who's being a person or not is subject to policing, not just by a system of authority, but by everyone who stands on the inside of that norm that's held in place by the people on the outside.
I think that's a great reflection on it. I also think there's a definitive connection in the same sense between these, the policing, slavery, and Jim Crow, as well as kind of capitalism and paternalism, and how they have really driven these systems and how they are still often very visible today. And so I wonder how we see, I think capitalism is probably the easiest to recognize. We've had a lot of pseudo-Marxist inspired works of the way that capitalism can take us down. Then you have Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale to look at how, paternalism could be the end of things. So kind of wondering how we see those systems advancing violence, both in science fiction policing and in real life.
One example that comes to mind for me that isn't apparently about policing at all, but is maybe an extension of what I was thinking about when you raised that question, is The Girl Who Was Plugged In by James Tiptree, or Alice B. Sheldon. In the story, the woman in the story is able to get out of a life experience determined by the constraints of her own physical body, a body that's not understood as attractive, as capable of everything, as this artificial body that she's able to sort of pilot. And that body, that person she can become, is able to move through society on a different basis, is able to be attractive, to have value. And so performing this role, which is something that she enters into because this kind of action is in demand in the society she lives in, performing that role offers her an experience of freedom that is not like an experience of humanity, but it is this kind of freedom that, precisely because she's a human with ordinary limits, with needs to eat and rest and sustain herself and real human connections that she can feel with her own body, she doesn't get to have those things because of the facts of being a human. But by becoming an artificial kind of person, satisfying certain demands that society has and that are rewarded for people living in certain kinds of bodies, she's able to sustain a social system in which, you might not be able to experience safety and fulfillment and a sort of lawful set of experiences you're entitled to as a free person as just, a regular human. But if there's some far-fetched possibility that technology offers to assign you a role, to facilitate someone else's accrual of capital, their advancement, to serve their interests or the interests of their class that you don't really belong to in the ordinary life you go home to, then you can be on the inside of that experience for the benefit of someone else. I think that we see cautionary tales like that sometimes about human enhancement in science fiction, and often that enhancement, that ability to enjoy greater possibilities and freedom, it's a revenue stream for someone. It's in order to serve the interests of someone else. It's maybe an interest convergence, the way Isiah is identifying that.
So,
Absolutely.
if I could ladder off André, because as André is speaking, this reminds me of two other stories that I think are very much in dialogue with the Tiptree story, and that are also getting at that tension between freedom and exploitation for someone else's profit. So one of those, of course, would be William Gibson's, now I'm losing the Winter Market. And Gibson himself is always very overt that he was in dialogue with the feminists of the 70s. And Winter Market is very much his rewriting of The Girl Who Was Plugged In. And it's about a disabled woman who is an amazing dream artist. And at first, everyone else is sort of, the able-bodied men around her are horrified by her physicality and overwhelmed by her artistic talent. And they don't know what to do with her. And in the end, she sells herself to Hollywood, and that Hollywood allows her to upload herself, and in exchange, she's essentially a slave who's going to do script writing for them for forever. And so that's an interesting story that I think makes very clear those links between othered bodies and the way othered bodies can be given freedom within a capitalist and patriarchal system. That's really freedom for who, right? Another story that I think really very much gets literally exactly at what we're talking about with incarceration and the Black experience is by Nisi Shaw, and it's a short story called The Mighty Finn from about, I think it's 2016. Yeah, I see some of you nodding here, right? And that's a marvelous story about a future where anyone who deviates from the norm has their body taken away, and they're turned into virtual slaves. Their minds are uploaded and then shipped off to far planets where they'll be downloaded into new bodies, and they'll do basically slave labor for the prison system. And what's interesting about the story is what the characters make very clear is that anything can get you thrown in jail, but really what gets people thrown in jail is being of color, being queer, or being disabled and embracing that disability. So anyone who embraces this otherness, and they're part of their punishment is that when they're uploaded, they're given virtual bodies that are made perfect. So the disabled are given bodies that are fully abled. The trans characters are put back into their biological sex bodies, things like that. Characters who play with skin color, for instance, are put back in their original bodies. And it becomes an interesting fight with their jailer, who's an artificial intelligence, who eventually also recognizes that it too has been used by the system in some very interesting ways, and has to make alliances with all these other people to survive and to live long and prosper.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was just going to chime in with a quick episode of Black Mirror. I think I was telling everyone you should watch Black Museum, and the end where the Black man is accused of murdering a weather woman, for lack of a better expression, and we know he doesn't do it, but he's accused. He's given the death penalty, and he has his consciousness uploaded right as he's dying into a digital holographic form. And he's put on display in a museum by the tech guy from the administration. He gets fired for it, but people are being charged. He's charging people money to come and torture this guy repeatedly with imaginary electrical shocks to the hologram. And his daughter comes in. The accused criminal or the convicted killer that's put to death, his daughter comes in and rescues him by killing his afterlife oppressor, for lack of a better expression again. So that for-profit motive to make money off of the pain and suffering of this wrongfully accused and convicted Black man murdered by the U.S. government in that story becomes a fascinating way of looking at this question of capitalism tying into the oppression of Black people and the murder of Black people.
I'm going to say I watched it right before we got on. Like I finished it maybe 20 minutes before we got on, and I was shook. Like this is yeah. So I definitely think this also brings us into the kind of question of new models of policing. It seems we've gone a little bit towards the idea of what synthetic bodies, what transfer of consciousness does for modes of incarceration. And so, as avid scholars and fans of science fiction, what ways can we imagine future technology changing the form of policing, both for good or for ill? So for good, there's trying to think of the instance, actually I'm probably thinking of an anime, Psycho-Pass, where weapons are only allowed to be discharged. There's a system that determines someone's threat level. And so therefore it is not really up to the cop themselves to determine how much force is meant to be used. So obviously that comes with problems, but that could be a good. Whereas, on the ill side, you have maybe persistent surveillance, which we're already getting to, software that racially profiles people, that kind of helps people be picked out. So any works you can think of are great examples of that, of where future technology could take us with policing.
One that I think we have seen recur and sort of go from science fiction to science fact in a number of ways in recent years is the short story Minority Report by Philip K. Dick. And as a short story, as a movie with Tom Cruise, and then as a television series with Megan Good, the narrative revolves around a future mode of policing in which people with special abilities or in conjunction with computer systems predict who will commit certain crimes, and sentences for those crimes are meted out in advance of their commission. A couple of things that story, I think, allows us to deal with is not just the notion that practically the prediction and perspective like deterrence and prevention of crime are, on the horizon as possibilities that would upend our belief in our right to be innocent until proven guilty. It's not just that threat of having our presumption of innocence taken away is a violation that a notion of pre-crime would entail. But it's, I think what that story gets at, and that might explain why it's adapted over and over again, is that when we see, data-driven policing and predictive policing and algorithms used to, determine if you live in a certain zip code, if your educational attainment is measured through standardized testing by a certain age, the population of persons who you would expect to be incarcerated 15, 20 years later should be n times some coefficient, right? Those notions that prevail very much in our long-term planning, in our investments in infrastructure and social support systems, and in our investments in policing, and in our notion of what laws we should even have, right? Not just what are you innocent of until you're proven guilty of, but what crimes are the police trying to deter, prevent, or in the judicial system punish? Our definitions of those things are largely tied up in, how we aggregate data about people, how we categorize people, how we map out possibilities that are available to people in their communities, and how we circumscribe ways that people should relate to each other that are lawful and unlawful. Policing is largely about sort of defining what relationships are permissible and what relationships and people are undesirable. So everything from the structure of, what neighborhoods have cops on the beat and what neighborhoods have lots of drug use or sexual exploitation or financial exploitation taking place inside the comfort of people's private homes or on their personal devices that are encrypted, as opposed to out in the open in a public place. All of those things are actually a lot closer to the prediction of crime than just the notion that, we're one technological breakthrough away from a person who can predict crime, mentally as a form of clairvoyance, or a computer system that can predict crimes that are likely to happen, because they're fundamentally about the way that we describe behaviors and relationships as crime and what we allow to be done in response to those possibilities.
The interesting thing about that is that Dick gave us a kind of a science fictional shortcut for or metaphor for the kinds of systems that we are building or we have been building.
Yeah.
What's interesting about those systems and that metaphor is that it's not grounded in we're going to correlate the data kind of sociologically from our society to figure out who is likely to produce to be a criminal by these metrics, et cetera, et cetera. It's more that we've already decided who's in and who's out. And so our algorithms will confirm our original biases, right? So you don't have pre-crime necessarily. Pre-crime becomes a kind of a nice new bumper sticker to put on who you've already decided is going to be a criminal, right? You just come in after a fact and say, look, the data shows, right? It confirms what we knew to be the case already, that Sidney Poitier, this is going to be off on the side here, that Sidney Poitier walking down a Miami street more than a century ago, right, could be espied by a couple of white cops who decide that he's a perfect target to be harassed, right? Because he's walking by himself. They harass him. They follow him for blocks, make him scared for his life before they leave and go off laughing, right? So they don't need the pre-crime system because they've already got a pre-crime algorithm inside them.
Right. Absolutely. So I find us with our perennial problem that we're running out of time, and obviously we could go 3 times as long. So I'm going to try to move us to, one of the other kind of related topics. So one of the things I think is kind of interesting is, there's a lot of discourse in science fiction about resistance, especially young adult science fiction in particular, about fighting back, about rebelling, rioting, we're going to tear it all down. But then when you listen to some of the public discourse on the media, people are like, these rioters, these protests must be stopped. We hate it. And so the question for me is kind of, why do people love movies, shows, books about rebellion, but in real life are so quick oftentimes to condemn those who fight back?
So I actually have some thoughts on this. I think that it has to do in some ways, weirdly, especially in science fiction, with what science fiction is, because what it is an invitation to experiment with the future, right? Science fiction is a virtual laboratory where we can test out different modes of action and how they may impact us in the future. And we may take that seriously, or we may take it as a thrill ride. It's thrilling to read about revolution, right? And it's exciting. And we like plots that have drama and action and come to a climax and then resolve themselves at least a little bit, right? Or at least they have a final season where you see the aftermath, like, what so many science fiction shows do. But when it comes to reality, a lot of us are very comfortable, right? And I think, for instance, one thing we're learning now during the pandemic is that some people embrace new information and change, and some people will fight it tooth and nail with every single thing they have within them, right? So fiction allows us to experience revolution and rebellion in a very safe way. But when it comes down to it in the real world, I think people are scared of change. A lot of people, especially, again, right, those with power. People always feel like power is a pie, right? And that there's only so many slices to go around. And if someone else gets a slice, then somehow your slice is smaller or gone. And it's sad. We need science fiction that shows us how we can multiply power, right, instead.
Right. So I would think some good stories with body swapping stories would work out well for helping people see beyond and maybe recognize that we're all the human species. So something that ends with violence would be George Schuyler's Black No More, and main character Max Disher, who is a con man and makes as much money, or Jack in the text, as he says, by playing as a white man, exploiting other white people to race bait and attack black people, and they're all trying to sell as much as they can in order to get the electrical process done to change themselves into whiter than white people, right? Which becomes the end of the story is the world ends up as a happy shade of brown, or something along those lines, right? And so that's a one way of looking at it. Then you could look at something like Mallow Hopkinson's A Habit of Waste, where you have a woman that saves up for 5 years to download her mind into an athletic, thin white body, as opposed to her thicker, big-bottomed black body, which she sees 2 years later after having the process done on a train, on a bus, and being admired, other people admiring her old body, which she saw so flawed, to where she goes home and looks at herself and, oh, is that crow's feet? Is my butt still pert? And this kind of thing. So body image issues come into play, and blacks have been warped by a European sense of beauty for so long, they don't know up from down. And that becomes an interesting way of looking at it. If we could walk a mile in someone else's shoes, to use that cliche, it might really help with the situation that we find ourselves in the United States of America, where fear-mongering seems to be the rule of the day right now.
So honestly, maybe a little more empathy is we're lacking in enough empathy to understand why people actually go out in the street and riot, as opposed to reading about it in a book and then closing it and going to sleep.
That is definitely, I think, an aspect of judging what stories are compelling and effective or not can be a matter of, does the story inspire you to reflect on how good you have it, as opposed to somebody going through something more difficult? Or does the story actually motivate you to action? Does it help you identify things in your life and in your environment that you could act on, that could make the kinds of changes that are desirable in a story?
Right.
I think that people gravitate toward stories of rebellion and transformation and revolution, in part for the same reason that people gravitate toward stories that involve dealing with hardship in more mundane and like historically realistic terms. As an English professor, many of us have the experience of teaching all kinds of literature that is not speculative in nature, that is realistic, that is grounded in fact. And when I teach slave narratives in African American literature classes, one of the things I always find it important to get students to think about is to approach the text not as the story of someone who had an experience of slavery that then gets them into the mindset of understanding what experiencing slavery was like for most people, where, that wouldn't have been legible, it wouldn't have been available because other people couldn't read and write about it. But instead, to let people know that these stories are in large part not the individual author's story, because they're an exception. And what we're looking for is what they are saying about the status that they lived in, the people around them, the people they came from, the people they knew, the people who didn't get free, the people who didn't write their stories. Because for every narrative we read, and with the condition of possibility of someone writing their story about having been enslaved being that they escaped that status and could reflect on it, right? It had a beginning and middle, and it had an end. Something that's valuable in reflecting on stories like that is to think most of the people who experience this transformation, the emancipation, the revolution, the end of the system itself, on the scale of something we could hope for today, most people who experienced it, the people the story's really about, are the many, many who lived and died, who went generations without that happening to them. And of course, most people don't want to live through what it's like to have a, oppressive, revolution-inspiring world historical evil happen to us, because it means many of us will see our entire lives and our children's and our grandchildren's lives go by without that changing, except eventually for some people who are not yet here and who are not us. So it's so rare to be the people who took part in the thing that can then write about how enormous and transformative and valuable it was. So I think there is something actually really relatable and practical, and that we should expect in people's attraction to stories of, dramatic transformation, but our continued, hesitance to engage in dramatic, transformative, revolutionary things. It means that the people who do that are, like us to a certain extent, but also if they are going to tell our stories of experiencing that, we're as likely to be a person who survives the change as we are to be a person for whom the change was made, but who isn't authoring that story.
So I hate to switch us. I think we have time for one more topic before we go to straight Q&A. And it was the respectability politics aspect of policing, right? So for those who, don't know what respectability politics are, really being the unwritten code that Black and brown bodies, disabled bodies, queer bodies are expected to adhere to. And this idea of having to not only be conscious of how you appear in public spaces, but to do that with an awareness of possible danger of there are also oftentimes consequences, as we've seen in a lot of these police situations. There are consequences to going against that code. And so looking into Afrofuturist texts, into speculative fiction in general, how would we say people address self-policing? Is it something that Black authors, Black writers of shows actually tend to lean into, or is it something we actually tend to avoid as something that's not a preferred way to be?
I don't know. It depends on how broadly you want to talk about respectability politics, because as you were talking about it, I was thinking about it as a kind of uniform. You could say that a show or a franchise like Star Trek is all about respectability politics. We can all come from wherever we come from, but as long as we put on the uniform and we believe in the uniform, we can all work together, right? What else can I say? Somebody follow me up on that. I'm just get excited.
I do think when we read stories about I'm thinking of a particular set of comic books right now by Ivan Velez Jr., who wrote a groundbreaking comic series called Tales from the Closet in the 90s about LGBTQ youth, and wrote superhero comics for Marvel and DC, like Ghost Rider, and wrote a comic book about a gang of people with superpowers, right? Where there are superheroes and villains, but this group of people the story's about are members of a gang, and they all have some kind of superpower. One of the characters is a trans man who gained the power to change their physical body to become an animal, to mimic someone else's appearance, and use that capacity to make their physical body give them the life experience of being a cisgender man. And there's a sort of, not a self-correcting or a self-altering, but kind of a self-affirming possibility that science fiction offers that helps us see how, like, some things that are criminalized, some things that are transgressive, some things for which people encounter violence and social sanctions can be, in a practical sense, virtually impossible. But if we were just to sort of erase that line between virtually impossible and actually impossible, we'd really have to question why so much violence accrues to the lives and bodies of people who know full well who they are and also know that we need a more expansive concept of what's possible for them to just go about living their lives, right? That you don't have to be a person who can, turn invisible to live your life without being detected by surveillance and police. But in fact, you could, but for a small change in our orientation to the way that we see each other and the world around us, live, unbothered. And stories like that use science fiction devices and fantastic devices to show us how much of how much vulnerability we carry around, and how much oppression we put up with, and how much we mete out to each other, and how much we agree that certain transgressions are going to be punishable even by death. Stories that sort of cast that in relief and show us, wow, this seems like a very unrealistic kind of thing to say, like, oh my gosh, a person can have the superpower that Beast Boy has in the Teen Titans, or a person can have the power to remove one of the most substantive obstacles in their daily life that is an obstacle in the daily lives of many people who are absolutely ordinary. Those kinds of stories really, to me, they drive home how much of that self-policing we do, not like for ourselves and for each other.
Do any of you know Minister Faust's book from the Notebook of Dr. Brain?
I know that,
because that's literally and exactly at what André is talking about, right? So it's a world where we have superheroes, and it's told from the perspective of a therapist to the superheroes, and she's working specifically. There's been a sort of I can't remember much about the book right now, but there's been a sort of disarray in the social order, and there's a disarray within the superhero order, and it all comes down to one black male superhero who's been really repressing the fact that he's gay, and that he feels he cannot express that, especially not if he's supposed to be a certain kind of manly superhero. And that problem, that his sort of constant self-policing, which is really like destroying him inside, ends up causing damage across the whole, social world. And I think that's a book that literally gets at that there, and using that idea of superheroes who are repressing part of their power and what makes them magnificent. I mean, it really drives that home. And I think to tell it in particular through a psychological framework is really telling, because it just makes, again, really obvious what we're talking about here. And maybe allows us to talk more directly about things. I know that that's what Minister feels. That's part of why he wrote that book, is like this becomes a way to talk about an issue that I know he finds is often difficult when he talks with young men and works with young men.
Right, and I would add Bill Campbell's Coontown Killing Caper, in a sense where you have a celebrity supermodel black female police woman that becomes a private detective after being shot and turned on by the police force, investigating vampire crack baby epidemic in her city that's loosely modeled on Pittsburgh, right? And so you get the inside track of what it is like to be a black female cop that's kicking butt, in essence, to get to the core of the mystery, where you have young black bodies on conveyor belts in the morgue being autopsied by robotic arms because of the pure amount of death that's going on there. It reminds you a lot of what's going on in our country in some ways, in black communities. And I think Campbell uses social satire, black humor to good effect in that, to bring attention to this. And I think everyone should read this novel, Coontown Killing Caper. And I'll leave it at that.
I know Bill Campbell. I don't know if he's here tonight, but that shout out, that was a good one. So we're supposed to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. I don't know if the questions are going to pop up, but as we're waiting just a minute to see if some of the last questions come in, thinking through if there are any last things you want to say really about the relationship between speculative fiction and policing. really even more broadly between speculative fiction and race. I've seen, it's interesting in some of the comments even leading up to this panel, on some of the Facebook posts, there were some people who were saying, why are you making science fiction about race? Science fiction doesn't need to be this political. To which I say, you and I have been reading a different type of science fiction, clearly. But, looking for you guys who, have gone through so much science fiction, have probably a very broad breadth of it, kind of what you believe is there for people, what people can take away from it.
I'd just say what science fiction isn't political would be my response. It's all politics in some kind of way, because it's always in dialogue with the present in which it is written. It's just been defamiliarized, right? Making the familiar seem unfamiliar and strange. That's what science fiction does in various ways. And so I find most science fiction political, whether you're reading Rebecca Roanhorse's Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience, to Onyebuchi's War Girls, or Invisible Planets collection by Ken Liu, and looking at Asian science fictions. And so it's got to be about the politics of life at its best for me.
And it's also about our history. Science fiction emerges from that. So if we would argue or accept that science fiction is not political, it is because we have accepted some old politics, the politics perhaps of the British Empire, for example, as a template for what Robert Heinlein's mid-1950s future would look like, for example. If we, accept that that's our consensus of what the futures look like, and if we're bringing alien rights into it, or robot rights into it, as Isaac Asimov did in the 1950s with the iRobot series, that we're not being political. That's strange.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we have reached our time. I hope we can continue this conversation both in some formal channel and informally moving into the future. So I want to thank all four of you again so much for volunteering your time tonight to have this discussion. We are going to move over to the second session with Tim Russ, Peter Macon, and Garrett Wang. So if you are going to join in, go back to your email, make sure you check for the link, and we will see you over there in a few minutes. So thank you all again, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.